In this use case, we'll look at the new time-bound policies feature that Kyverno 1.9 enables and how you can use this potentially with your existing policies to give you some sort of a time window, either for activation or deactivation of that policy. Now, here's what we want to do here. We have a policy. Typically, this may be something like a validate rule that impacts security, and you only want that policy to be active for a certain amount of time, and or perhaps that policy should be inactive, whichever way you'd like to define it. Typically, without something like this, you'd have to manually go in or maybe programmatically change the policy. In the case of a validate rule, the validation failure action from something like enforce, which would block non-compliant resources to audit to allow them through. Or maybe you'd have to delete the policy. In Kyverno 1.9, we added some custom filters that will allow Kyverno to understand what the current time is and use that as a factor as to whether the policy should be operating or not. So in this use case, we have a policy that I'm going to take from the pod security standards because these are the low-hanging fruit of ones that impact security. And this will be the host namespace policy. The host namespace policy, you really want active in your cluster almost all the time. But there may be some cases in like outage situations where you need access to the capabilities that that policy would block. For example, let's say that you had a host related issue and you didn't have direct SSH access to the host. You might need to spawn a pod on that host to be able to access the host and run some troubleshooting commands. Without this ability, you would either have to, as I mentioned, change the validation failure action so that you could allow the pod through, or delete the policy entirely. With this feature, that's not true any longer. You can configure a window in which the policy will operate. And so that's what I'm doing here. We want this policy to have effect in enforce mode during business hours, so 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And so if a user or process attempts to submit a pod which would violate that policy during business hours, then we want that pod to be blocked. But outside of that, when the troubleshooting window may be accessible, we would like that pod to be enabled. And of course, this is extremely flexible. You can change this in any way that you like. You can narrow this down. You can open it up. There are a lot of different things that you can do with it. But here, I'm going to try and create a bad pod, and that pod should be blocked because this policy is in effect. And then if I create the same pod that's outside of the window, the policy should not take effect. The pod doesn't change, but because this time bounding window has ended, the policy should allow the pod through. Let's flip over and take a look at this. Now, in this case, I've just taken an existing cluster policy, the disallow host namespaces policy, which is part of the pod security standards, and have added this ability to it in the form of a precondition. And so in this precondition, this is what we want to have happen. We want to have this policy, which, as you can see, will ensure that if any of these fields are present, they must be set to false. We only want to enforce this during business hours every day, as this comment indicates. And so what we're going to do here is use these new James path filters, and you can see that they're kind of changed together here in order to get the current time and extract the hour from that. And if that hour is found within this value, which in UTC, this corresponds to our 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. time window, then the policy will be evaluated. And should a pod which may violate this be found, it will be immediately blocked. But if it's outside of that window, the value will not be in this range and the pod will be allowed. Here's a pod which would violate this. This is just called troubleshooting pod, and I'm just going to run busybox to sit out there. But you can see that I do have host IPC set to true, which is forbidden according to this policy, which states it must be set to false. So let's try and first create the policy, and the policy is created. And now let's create this pod. And now, as of this recording, I'm running this at about quarter to 11 a.m. And so this will be within the window of the policy, and therefore the pod should be blocked. And you can see here the pod is in fact blocked. Now, in order to test this, I have to actually go and change the window to be narrower in scope since I can't change the time. So let's simulate what this would look like if I were running it outside of these business hours by changing this value to something like 2000 hours to 2200 hours. Let me just go and update this cluster policy. Now we have a much narrower range. It's only going to operate within that span. And so let's try and recreate the same pod. And you can see here that our troubleshooting pod was allowed to be created because after adjusting the time window, it found that the time is not within that. And because it was not within it, we didn't evaluate the policy and the pod was allowed. So hopefully you can see how something like this can be really useful in a cluster that you may actually need these capabilities. And so you can apply this same type of processing to really any Kyverno policy that you want. It doesn't have to just be validation, but it can be done with any existing policy just by adding a precondition as long as you're on Kyverno 1.9.